Hi, I'm Mike from the MySQL Workbench team, and in this video I want to show you how to create server connections in MySQL Workbench and give you a few tips for troubleshooting if anything goes wrong. I will cover connections to local and remote machines and will demonstrate how to set up remote WMI and SSH management. Creating a local connection is very simple, and, provided you have installed the MySQL server in the default location, the setup is rather a matter of a minute. When you start Workbench the first time, you get a straight screen with only a few options. For each locally installed server, a connection tile is automatically created for you. To start the creation of a new connection, click the small plus button beside the connection's title. A dialog opens where you can enter the necessary information. By default, values for a simple local connection are pre-filled already for you. Give your connection a name and check especially the host parameter, which determines to which machine you will connect. By default, the MySQL server uses port 3306, so you can leave it that way if you did not change the port during installation. Finally, pick a user to connect with. On a fresh installation, only the root user with full access to everything in the server is available. Once you are done with that, click Test Connection to see if the entered parameters work correctly. After closing the dialog, you get a new connection tile on the home screen. Clicking on that will open the new connection. Each tile has a small area that opens a pop-up with a quick overview for the connection. Here you can see what version the server has and when you connect to it last time. That's obviously available only after you connected at least once. You can edit a connection's properties at any time, but keep in mind changing them requires to reopen the connection to take effect. To edit a connection, right-click on its tile and select Edit Connection from the context menu. The Connection Manager opens with the connection pre-selected. Alternatively, you can open the manager via the wrench button on the home screen. A MySQL connection can be configured in various ways, of which MySQL Workbench supports the most important ones. In the server, encrypted communication to the client can be enabled via the SSL settings. Other options determine how client and server speak to each other. You can enable compression for less traffic, set an explicit SQL mode, or use ANSI quotes for identifiers. You can also find checkboxes to toggle the new clear text authentication plugin and the old authentication protocol. Note, there is no way to configure the connection character set. This is because MySQL Workbench always uses UTF-8 for maximum flexibility. That's it for the initial setup of a local connection. Let's take a look on Windows and how it looks there. Also on Windows, connections are auto-created if there are none defined yet when Workbench is started. In this example, I have two servers installed on this box. Setting up a connection here is exactly the same as on Mac, or Linux for that matter. However, there's a little speciality on that platform. On Windows, MySQL servers must be installed as a service to be usable by MySQL Workbench. Well, you can also work with manually started MySQL servers, but that limits Workbench significantly. Let's pretend one of the services MySQL Workbench is now configured with does not run. For this, open the Computer Management Console and select the Services section. Scroll down to your MySQL server entries and stop one. When you now go back to Workbench and open the connection, you will see that it still succeeds. But as you quickly notice, Workbench recognizes the server as not reachable. When you switch to the query editor, you will see all the actions that require an open connection are disabled. Also, the navigator pane, which usually contains a tree of schema objects, is empty. In order to have a better view, I recommend to switch the sidebar to the non-combined mode, which places management and schema sections each on an own tab. You do that by clicking the little expand button. You can switch at any time back and forth. This setting is also kept for the next run of Workbench. Switching back to the Management section, we can now select the Startup Shutdown page, which allows us to change the state of the server without opening the computer management console. Clicking on Start Server will then start the service, thereby also running the MySQL server. The log window below that button reflects any message the server logged during that startup sequence. A good means to check for problems if that process fails. You can now do a last check in the computer management console to verify the service is up again. Switching back to Mac OS X, we now focus on some troubleshooting with respect to connection parameters. Assume we have a local connection that doesn't work yet. Opening that connection gives you the same not connected view as we just saw on Windows. Opening the connection properties and doing a connection check shows us the message can't connect to MySQL server. Please note the exact wording of the error, as this is essential to find a solution. Can't connect always means Workbench could not reach the server. It has nothing to do with user rights or similar in the server. So what we need to fix now is the network parameters to reach the server. Hence, the first step is to check host and port settings, which are both given in the error message. As we have seen before, our local server is installed with the default port, which is 3306. So this is the first thing we fix. To do this, we return to the Connection Parameters tab and change the port there. Another connection check shows we are fine now. While this was very simple, there can be other traps that are not that obvious, especially when it comes to network addresses the server is listening to. This also involves user settings, especially the host a user can connect from, which also holds true for local connections. In fact, we have three ways of specifying a local connection. One is the IP version 4 loopback interface address 127.0.0.1 that we use by default. The next one is the local host name, which is resolved by default to the loopback interface address. For MySQL, this makes no difference. A user who is allowed to connect from localhost also can connect from 127.0.0.1 and vice versa. MySQL Workbench, however, uses the given hostname as part of the service key that is used to store password information, so it makes a difference here. For example, you can store the password for 127.0.0.1 in the key chain, but are still asked for it when you use localhost. Things change, however, if you also have enabled IPv6 on your box, which offers the third way of specifying the local address. The IPv6 loopback interface address is : 1. As you can see, a connection is still possible, but also here the service key for storing the password is different in MySQL Workbench. The main trouble here is how localhost is resolved. Depending on your box, it can either be IPv4 or the IPv6 loopback address. If you have a user configured that is explicitly bound to either of these addresses, and you have a third-party software that uses localhost for the connection, for instance a WordPress or Joomla installation, the user might not be able to connect, as localhost might be resolved to the wrong network address. Use a terminal and the ping command to check how the resolution is done. On the Mac, even though IPv6 is activated and worked when we tested the connection, the ping command shows that localhost is resolved to the IPv4 loopback address. On Windows, however, this is different. Here, localhost resolves to the IPv6 address. So it's essential to keep this in mind when using localhost as host connection parameter. When speaking of network connections, especially when using TCP/IP, it is also good to know that there are settings for MySQL which can change the behavior of the server. In MySQL Workbench, you can view and change any of them on the Network tab in the config file settings. It goes beyond this tutorial to explain these settings in detail, but one thing is especially important. If the server is set to skip networking, it will not accept any TCP/IP connection whatsoever. The only way to connect to a server configured that way is to use a named pipe on Windows or a socket on Mac and Linux. We start again by adding a new connection. In this example, there is a remote Windows server called fold, for which I have added an entry to my hosts file to make the name fold resolve to its actual IPv4 address. A click on the connection test button shows us that there is something wrong. Especially the delay until we get a response is a good indicator that not the server as such is the problem, but something on the way to it. Also here we get the same can't connect to MySQL server error as before, just with a different hostname, which is a clear indicator that we have a network problem. As we want to connect to a remote machine, it gives rise to the suspicion that something with the port settings or the hostname is wrong. A simple ping with the hostname removes doubts about that, so only the port problem remains. A nice trick to quickly check if network access via the given host and port is possible at all through all the firewalls and port settings of the target server is to use the telnet command. This will not use the correct communication protocol for the server, but it can at least connect if all is fine, as we will see later. However, this telnet check failed, even though access to the server is fine, which suggests that our firewall settings do not allow outbound traffic via our selected MySQL port. To fix that, open your firewall settings, select the outbound rules and add a new rule. This is a straightforward process given the simple wizard interface. We limit the rule to just a single port and allow it for all profile types. If you have connections to different ports, then it may make more sense to specify the rule for Workbench instead just a single port. Or you can use a port range. Give it a speaking name and we are done with that. Time for another connection attempt, but as you can see, there is still no success. Let's check the target server then. The very first check should always be to see that the server service is running. If this is not the case, start it now. We could do this from within Workbench, but it makes troubleshooting a lot harder if any of the involved parts is not working properly first. Then also open the firewall settings there and create a new rule. This time, however, we use an inbound rule. Inbound and outbound rules are related to the process that creates the connection. The initiator needs the outbound rule. Once this is done, we don't need another rule for transmitting data. Hence we only need an inbound rule on the target machine. We do it the same way as we just did on the client box. Back to our telnet test, we see that it now finally succeeds. The output is weird lingo caused by the telnet and the MySQL server not understanding each other, but that doesn't matter. All we need to know is that the connection succeeded. With that, we can now be sure the network configuration part is done. Now let's switch back to Workbench. Finally, we get the password dialog for our connection and can continue. Give the service string a quick check too. It concretely describes what we want the password for. This is not always only a MySQL server connection, as we will see in a moment. We can now successfully open the connection and end up with a working SQL IDE environment. But there's no cigar yet. We still miss the management part. In the navigator bar, you see that most of the management entries are disabled. Only those that directly work with the server, for instance user management, can be used. The server status, however, shows us the details of the connected server, even though the directory values are still incorrect. Likewise, we can view the current client connections. Back on the home screen, we now start the management setup using a wizard dialog. You can trigger this wizard by either using the Configure Remote Management button on the info pop-up, as we do here, or use the Connection Management dialog. First, the wizard connects to the target MySQL server with the already entered credentials. Hence, these must be correct at this point. This connection attempt is to determine the target OS and the server version to help with further steps. On the next page you have the choice of either use native Windows remote management, which involves WMI as mentioned before, or SSH. We select WMI here. Next, the wizard will ask you for the credentials for the WMI service. This is not a MySQL user, but a user with administrator rights on the target Windows machine. It not only must have rights to access administrative shares, but also must be allowed to connect via WMI. Users in the local administrator group already have those rights. Watch closely what the wizard prints out at this point. If you use the wrong credentials, no connection is established and the service drop-down stays empty. After such an error, switch back and forth again to re-trigger the connection attempt. After using the correct user and password values, the list is populated with all services that might have to do with MySQL for you to choose. Also, the path to the configuration file is pre-filled using an administrative share. We can now continue and finish the wizard at this point. However, reviewing the values before finishing is often a good idea, as we will see in a moment. Open the connection and switch to the server control page. We get an error here and a button to fix the setting at this point. For some reasons, auto-detecting the operating system did not work correctly, hence no management commands are specified. Additionally, we have no server setting, which is only available when we configure for Windows. Before switching the system type, it is advisable to copy the current config file path to avoid having to repick it again. After switching to Windows and selecting the proper installation type, we can paste in the path. As last action, we fix the name of the service too, and off we go for a new attempt. The server control page can now be loaded, and the server status page gives us essential information about the target machine. By that, we have finished setting up a remote connection with Windows as target's operating system using WMI for management. The third part of this video demonstrates the creation of a remote connection that uses SSH for management. This is the best supported variant in the MySQL Workbench and works across all platforms. The creation of the connection differs this time, as we now have an SSH tunnel involved that is transferring all communication with the remote box. The interesting fact here is that the MySQL server access is the same as if Workbench would run on that remote machine. Such a tunnel is also useful if you cannot or don't want to open the MySQL server port in your firewalls, which is a very common scenario with corporate networks or access to web hosting. Since SSH is a safe communication means, the port it uses is often open already and can hence be used for our work too. Setting up the connection begins with changing the connection mode to TCP/IP over SSH, which displays a new set of settings. We now have several sets of credentials that take part in the setup. One set, a username and password or key file, is needed for the tunnel. Another one is the usual MySQL user login. In the SSH hostname field, enter the address or name of the machine that is the endpoint of the SSH tunnel. This may not be the same machine where the MySQL server is running on. It's the box where an SSH server is running, to which we connect our tunnel. If you use a different than the standard port for SSH, which is 22, add it to the server name separated by a colon. You can already enter the password for the tunnel by clicking on the button Store in Fold, if you want that. Alternatively, select the path to a locally stored private key file of a previously created public and private key pair. Next comes the usual setup of the MySQL server connection. Keep in mind here that you enter the host as seen from the remote SSH server, not from your local box. You can now do the first check of the connection. Take also a moment to understand how the service key has changed now. The key consists of the service, which can either be MySQL, WMI, SSH or sudo, followed by the MySQL server address and ends with the SSH tunnel address and port. Once the connection test confirmed the correctness, we can do some further customization, like enabling compression or ANSI quotes, and are done with the connection part. In our setup procedure, it is now a good time to also handle the management setup. Continue the wizard to select the management type and the target operating system. As you can see, sometimes auto detection doesn't work so well. Hence, you have here the opportunity to set the correct values. The predefined MySQL installation types contain settings for the default path of the configuration file and the commands used to control the MySQL server. The next page essentially assembles the previously entered SSH settings again and should be pre-filled with the values you entered already in the connection dialog. If something is wrong, then correct it and continue. MySQL Workbench now checks if the configuration file can be found at the path given by the MySQL installation type we picked in the previous step, and also for the startup and shutdown commands. You will get an error message if any of these checks fails, but you can always continue from here and adjust the settings, as we will see in a moment. The next step is to either simply continue if your settings are correct, you will then be directly brought back to connection setup, or as we do now, review these settings. You get a list of information the wizard collected. If you see any mistakes, then set the checkbox Change Parameters before you continue. In that case, you will get more pages to manually adjust the settings. The first of these allows you to select your configuration file with a remote file browser. The other one can be used to adjust the start-stop command. With that, we are done doing the management setup and can return to the home screen. By the way, if you don't like to go through all the wizard pages, you can always directly enter all values in the connection editor. You need this also if you want to change anything in the connection after the initial setup. We now can open the connection and get a first overview of the machine on the server status page. If you want, take a look at the current client connections. Finally, let's shut down the server as a test of the correct setup. You should probably notify all clients that are currently connected to that server before you shut it down. The shutdown sequence needs to run a sudo command or script, hence we have to provide credentials for that. Similar for starting the server up again. With a working setup like this, we can now also view remote files, including the server's log files, if they are enabled, and of course the configuration file.